of it, that is, to the state. So once you give your word or agreement, Locke says, you are perpetually and indispensably obligated to that state. That's how seriously Locke takes this idea of consent. It's something that can only be entered into at the age of discretion. It must be given consciously, fully, rationally, presumably in some kind of ceremony. And once given, your consent to the form of government remains, as he says, perpetual and perpetual. You are bound unalterably, as he puts it. There's no such thing as taking it back. It shows you how important Locke puts on the word or the oath or some kind of civil agreement. One's word is one's bond. To give voice or consent to government is not an act to be entered into lightly, he says, or implies, but it is a kind of lifetime commitment. And it also shows us how different Locke's view of the citizen is from ours. In other words, it would seem for Locke, the only people who are full citizens in our country would be people who have given their active consent. And the only people who have given their active consent are people who have undergone what we interestingly call a kind of naturalization process. Is anyone here a naturalized citizen, as we call it? Has anyone ever been to a naturalization process? No? Nobody? Where people go to, it's administered by a judge, and you swear allegiance to the new country. Presumably you shed your obligations to your previous country. You swear your allegiance to this one. That seems to be the kind of thing Locke appears to be talking about. And it's interesting that, again, the only people in our society, in our country, who would be full citizens would be naturalized citizens. Again, birth alone does not confer on you citizenship of any particular country. But what does that mean for the rest of us? Those who have not given their active consent. Locke is aware that not everyone gives their active consent. That's why he introduces another idea for how consent may be given. He talks about what he calls tacit consent. There are those maybe who have not sworn allegiance or given a civil oath, but who nevertheless can be said to have given their tacit consent to the form of government and its laws. But how do we give tacit consent? Tacit consent is a strange word because consent implies something active and open, where tacit, think of Locke, taciturnity. Tacit implies something closed or concealed. How is tacit consent given? That's a problem that you can see Locke working on. To some degree, he says, anyone who simply enjoys the protection of the law, the security of property and person under the law, can be said to have given their tacit consent. They give it, so to speak, ex silentio. Even their silence confers consent. But how do we really know, you could say? How do we know that silence confers tacit consent and silence is not simply silence? An example I think of, for example, if you go to a wedding ceremony, or I guess in some wedding ceremonies, the justice or the minister, whoever says, whoever, what is the phrase about whoever hold your peace, if anybody has any question about this ceremony, speak now or forever hold your peace. And of course everybody's, except in the movies of course, everybody's always silent. Nobody says it. So their consent, you might say, their tacit consent is given. Their silence from their silence to that question, their tacit consent is given. But again, that would be one way. But again, how do we know, again, when silence confers tacit consent or silence is simply that, silence? It's an issue that Locke struggles with. and to be sure never fully or I think satisfactorily resolved. Maybe you will resolve it. Maybe you will resolve it in your next paper if you have the opportunity to write about consent and the difference between the express and tacit form of citizenship. And also the question being, which Locke alludes to but does not fully or does not quite answer, is there any difference in privileges, in civil privileges, between citizens who have given their express consent and those who have only been said to tacitly consent to the form of government? Does he suggest that one class of citizens has greater rights or greater responsibilities than the other? You might look into that question too and see if you think Locke suggests any differences on that. Locke, to go back and just kind of begin to wrap this up for today, Locke does not appear to endorse any particular form of government in the second treatise. The task of forming the government will fall to the decision of the majority. But again, what form the majority will decide remains to some degree an open question. What gives Locke or Lockeanism its distinctive tone, its distinctive voice, is the claim that whatever kind of government a majority decides upon, it must be one that limits the power of the sovereign. We cannot, in this respect, I think Locke is far closer to Lincoln than he was to Stephen A. Douglas. Consent does not simply mean consent to arbitrary rule. It does not mean consent for the power of the sovereign to do anything. Locke's theory of constitutional government is a theory of restrained government, of constitutional restraints, of rule by law. Locke gives in many ways the importance of law and constitutional restraint, what we would today call, I suppose, limited government. He gives this far greater expression, far more powerful expression than any of his predecessors. Certainly not Hobbes, who had attributed absolute power to government, or even to Aristotle, who in many ways shares some resemblances with Locke, but even Aristotle had severe doubts about rule of law. Locke is absolutely confident that limited government, restraints on power, whether that power be from the one, the few, or the many, restraints on power is the only kind of government that can be trusted to protect rights. And in one of the few jokes that appears in the second treatise, you might have missed it because Locke is a subtle jokester. He's not like Machiavelli or Plato. Locke is a very understated jokester. You know, he was an Englishman after all. He writes in section 93, referring to Hobbes, but you'll also see his wonderful animal references. He writes in Hobbes, as if men quitting the state of nature entered into society, they agreed that all of them but one should be under the restraint of laws, thinking about Hobbes's Leviathan, but that he should still retain all the liberty of the state of nature, increased with power and made licentious by impunity. He goes on to say, this is to think that men are so foolish that they take care to avoid what mischiefs be done to them by polecats and foxes, but are content, nay, think it safety, to be devoured by lions. The lion being the Leviathan sovereign. Whereas in the Lockean state of nature, human beings are like polecats and foxes. They're noxious creatures, he says, but they're not truly dangerous to you. And when one enters the state of nature, when one leaves the state of nature to enter civil society, one is certainly not doing so to empower a sovereign with lion-like powers over you, as he says. Who would do this? It's better to have some kind of theory of restrained government, limited government, to to do this for you. What I want to do, I'm going to end on this note, what I want to do on Monday when I wrap up Locke is to continue with his doctrine of limited government, because it turns out there is a very important exception to it. There is a kind of escape clause, and I would encourage you, as you read it, to pay particular attention to chapter 14 of the second treatise, his chapter on what he calls prerogative power, the doctrine that has very, very important and grave implications for our politics today. It's a very important chapter, and I want us to continue this and then talk a little bit about the pros and cons of Lockean political philosophy.